Okay, hey, I'm Gene Fosheim. I'm a lifelong Everett resident. We're going to talk about one of my favorite places anywhere around here. This is Evergreen Cemetery, our historic cemetery, actually the second one in Everett. And it's about 100 acres. We have about 60,000 grave sites in here. And it was started in 1898. So this is wonderful. Behind me is the original entrance to the cemetery. This is the historic Lich Gate. These originated in England. They were in the churchyards in the cemetery or the big cemeteries, and they're used all over the place. The body would actually rest in here, sometimes in a casket, in this case, or in England, just the body. And then the preacher would come, the family would come, and this would be where they'd kind of start their ceremony and go into the cemetery. Back in 1898, when Evergreen Cemetery opened, we actually had a trolley line coming from downtown Everett right up Broadway to 41st Street area here, and they could bring the casket from the funeral home by rail right here and then carry it in. So we're going to walk inside the cemetery and see some pretty spectacular stuff. Not only great grave sites, but some of the best landscaping you'll ever see. Okay, hey, I'm standing right next to the grave of Ollie Olson. This is not his marker. He has an unmarked grave right here, which a lot of people do, unfortunately. But he was killed by James Canella in 1898 down at Hewitt and Wetmore. They didn't like one another. Canella was an editor of the newspaper, a writer, and Ollie was a businessman, and they got into a fist fight here and there, where they finally got into a fist fight where a gun was drawn, and that was the end of Ollie. So he's in an unmarked grave here. And if we look around here in this area, this is the very first part of the cemetery. It started in 1898, and you'll say, well, there aren't too many graves. Well, believe me, this whole area is full of graves, but most of the markers have either disappeared in the last 120 years, or they were unmarked, they didn't have the money for a marker, or they'd put these little concrete markers that were provided, and they disappeared over the years. Some are actually even buried under the grass. So that's why it looks kind of sparse in these older areas. We're going to walk over here to some really interesting graves that are unique. What we have here is very unique to Evergreen and any cemetery in this area. These are 3 graves of Japanese immigrants. This was unusual. We didn't have too many Japanese around, but we did have quite a community over at Japanese Gulch toward Munkatil. Anyway, these 3 immigrants were buried here. They died of various causes. They worked in the Everett area, and one of the local business owners, he took pretty good care of the Japanese community. He paid for their graves, and they were buried here. Now, the one here died in 1901. These others were earlier. Actually, a couple of them died in 1901. But why are they here? Well, they were buried in 1901, but the early one, which was 1893, must have been buried somewhere else and then moved over to the cemetery here. And that's not unusual. The first cemetery in Everett was Greenwood Cemetery. It was located on 52nd and what is now Evergreen Way, right across the Evergreen Way from the local Ford dealer. There were 216 graves there that were dug up by the 1920s, and they were all moved here to Evergreen. Plus there were little private cemeteries around the area, so you will see graves here that are older than 1898. They were buried somewhere else and then brought here. Of those 216 that were brought here, they're spread around the cemetery. I guarantee you they didn't get them all. So next time you go up to that little strip mall, there's probably a couple people underneath where you're parking, so keep that in mind. Okay, we're going to walk over here to the Civil War area. This is a monument to the about 150 Civil War veterans that we have buried here in Evergreen, and people wonder, why do we have Civil War veterans? Well, so many of them in their older age moved out here to live with their kids, and this is where they died. That's why. So they came out here to be farmers or work in the booming city of Everett. This is the John Buford Post Monument, Grand Army of the Republic, GAR, and they financed this and made grave sites available for free to the veterans when they died that couldn't afford a grave site. This was dedicated actually not too long ago this was put together, but the site has been here since right after the cemetery was built. So the Beaufort Post was active from 1894 up until 1946, right after World War II. By then all the Civil War veterans were gone, of course. We're going to talk a little bit about just one of the veterans here, Joseph Casson. He was a blacksmith with Company M, the 9th New York Cavalry, and he lived from 1837 until 1902 when he died here in Everett. And I'm going to read a few notes I have about him. He enlisted in 1861, right at the beginning of the war, of the 9th New York Cavalry, Company M, and he was 24 years old. He was promoted to blacksmith, and he was active in some of the biggest battles of the Civil War: Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and Appomattox. Casson mustered out in July 1865, so he was in for the full 4 years of the war. He ended up, he was never wounded, but he did receive a $6 a month pension for a kidney ailment that he had, probably from riding his horse too much. In 1895, he relocated to Everett, and we don't really know why, but he later became a resident of the Washington Soldiers' Home in Ording, Washington. In April 1902, he was traveling from Ording to Everett on the steamship City of Everett and suffered a stroke and died the next day at 65 years old. So that's kind of the story of a lot of our Civil War veterans. Came out here, we don't know why sometimes, but mostly to live with family, and they end up dying here. It's interesting about Joseph Casson, he was a private the whole time he was in, and he was in for 4 years, so I don't know, you know, what the story is beyond that. But a lot of Civil War veterans all over the cemetery. But this is the group that honors them right here. Every cemetery is full of strange stories, and we'll talk about just a couple of them, but we're just full of them. Over here along the hedge close to the road, there's actually a little gap in there where there used to be a poplar tree. We have an unmarked grave with a little girl buried there. Well, Alvin Goldthorpe, her brother, lost his arm in a hunting accident, and he wanted his arm buried next to his sister, baby. So he came out here. Some stories said he did it himself, others said he got a little help. Basically, he dug a grave for his arm, and it's put in there unmarked by his baby sister. When poor Alvin died years later, he and his prosthetic arm were buried over in Cypress Lawn. So they were never joined together again. Okay, one other thing up here. This is a really interesting grave, and I've got a few notes about this guy. This is Governor Louis Kossuth's church, and he was not the governor of Washington, but he was a governor of the Dakota Territories, the first governor. He was very good friends with a couple of our presidents. Cleveland, President Cleveland actually gave him the governorship of the Dakota Territories. After Cleveland was defeated by Harrison, he moved out here into Everett and did a lot of the platting of the property in the original downtown area. So interesting person. He was here and very, very good friends with Teddy Roosevelt before he came out here. He worked with Teddy Roosevelt in New York City. Unfortunately, he died fairly young because he did go up to Alaska on a trip, and he caught pneumonia or something up there, and he died in Alaska, but they brought him back here to be buried. He has a very modest headstone on the hillside right there. Okay, we've got one of the sad stories here. This is Charlie Raymond. He was a detective and police officer from Lowell. Unfortunately, he was killed in a gunfight in Bothell with the notorious criminal Harry Tracy. Now, Harry Tracy was one bad dude. Harry Tracy was eventually surrounded in Lincoln County and committed suicide. But before that, Harry Tracy killed as many as a dozen people. In fact, Bruce Dern played Harry Tracy in a movie back in the 60s that was filmed that I haven't seen yet, but I'm going to have to dig it up and watch it. But Harry Tracy was possibly the last member of the famous Wild Bunch, but we don't know for sure. That's one of the legends. Anyway, so but it could be, and many people said at the time that Harry Tracy was the nastiest criminal ever in the history of the United States. He was a pretty bad guy, but poor Charles Raymond, he paid the price right here. When Evergreen was laid out, this old original area here was just a beautiful plat, a beautiful design. I'm standing on what is actually a roadway, but you wouldn't know it. It's covered with grass now. The only thing you can tell, there's no graves right here. But it had a very unique design all the way up here and up the hillside. It was beautiful. Over in the distance, we have this magnificent copper beech tree, one of at least 4 Washington State champion trees here in Evergreen. A champion tree, there's a certain point system that you add up the points with the height and the width to come up with that number. But that tree is magnificent. It's just fantastic, especially with those beautiful leaves. Off in the distance over here in the bushes, you can actually see it now, is what's the remains of our comfort station. The toilet is still there, but for the first 20 years of the cemetery, or maybe longer, we don't know for sure, there was an area right here where the families, of course, could use the restroom. The building is gone, but the remainder, the toilet is still there, and it still has its plumbing attached to it. Normally you can't see that because the blackberries are so thick and overgrown in here, but the graves actually do go way back into there too. It was cleared off last year, so we can see it at this time. I want to mention another thing while we're here. A lot of the graves that you see in this cemetery, we have distinct ethnic groups. In the old part of the cemetery, you're going to see a lot of English, Irish names, all German, European names. We had the Japanese there, but that was a very unusual thing. Very, very few African Americans, almost none in the cemetery. They were allowed here, that was not a problem. We just didn't have the population in Everett. Very few Asians until you get in the new section. As we go farther in the cemetery, you can see the development of Everett. When we go toward the middle of the cemetery, you'll see all kinds of Scandinavians. Like my grandpa came over here in 1909 in this area. My dad was born in 1914. They came from Norway. And the Scandinavians came into Everett by the thousands around 1900 to 1920. Mostly worked in the sawmills. Then as you get farther along, you'll see a different mixture of people. But any cemetery you go in the United States, it's kind of fun to see the development of the different people that came from different parts of the world, and Evergreen is no different. We're going to walk up the hillside here toward the west. This monument here, this old one, is Ezra Hatch. He's one of a handful of the Mexican War veterans, which was well before the Civil War by a couple decades. And he came out here and settled in Everett. He, like a lot of settlers, he took on an American Indian wife from one of the local tribes, and they lived out their life in this area here. So that's a unique one. This one is a sadder story here. We have Peter and Rena Arensbach. Now Rena came from France. Peter brought her over. They ended up in New York City, but then he wanted to move out to Everett. So he brought her out here to Everett. They had a pretty contentious relationship, it seemed like. And after just a very short time in Everett, she decided she didn't want to put up with all these rowdy people and the lowlifes in Everett compared to New York City. So one day she shot her husband and then shot herself. So homicide, suicide, and they're happily buried together. We would never know it. You know, you look and say, hey, husband and wife, oh, they died the same day. Well, that's why. We have what looks like a new grave here. It's got a new marker on it for Martin Cummins. Well, Martin Cummins died a long, long time ago. And when a good friend of mine, J.D. Howard, was writing his book on Monte Cristo, he did a lot of research on Martin Cummins and found out with the help of the Granite Falls Society and others that he was buried here in Evergreen. By gosh, they located his grave. They ended up getting a marker for him, and here he is. So Martin Cummins was in an unmarked grave for a long time, and J.D. Howard took on this project of finding him when he wrote his book, The Pride of Monte Cristo. Okay, one of the sadder spots in Evergreen Cemetery here is the Bucy Monument. And in 1902, Miss Bucy, she kissed her husband, put her arms around him, and shot him in the head and killed him. Then she went on and also killed her 4-year-old son. The mother was there, her mother, took their 18-year-old baby and ran out the door as fast as she could. So Mrs. Bucy, she ended up killing herself. So it was a triple, well, double homicide and then a suicide. She had one bullet left in her gun, which we figure was there for the baby. So they're buried here together in eternity, but not a real happy, not a real happy result. Also in this location, if you look down the hillside and in back of me, some of you may remember a film from 1995 called Assassins. Antonio Banderas and Sylvester Stallone. In the very first 15 minutes of the movie, they had a shootout here at Evergreen Cemetery. And it was very interesting for a cemetery buff because it shows a little history of the cemetery. Not my favorite movie, but that first part is always worth watching. Antonio Banderas, he hid behind the Bucy Monument that we see right here. The most interesting part of the movie, of course, is typical Hollywood. They went running out the front gate, hopped in their cars, and drove straight north to Seattle. Well, this is undoubtedly the most famous spot in Evergreen Cemetery. This is the Rucker Tomb. Now, this is not only the most famous spot in this cemetery, but I have pretty much visited every major cemetery within the United States, all 50 states, and this place is phenomenal. There's nothing else like it. We have mausoleums around, but this one's a very special one. When Mary Rucker died in 1907, her sons, Wyatt and Bethel, they wanted to have a monument to their mother. Now, they're very famous names in Everett. Of course, the Rucker, we have Rucker Avenue, excuse me, and they made their money in timber and real estate and were great for the city of Everett. Well, they built this for their mom, and then their dad had been buried in Ohio. He was shipped out here also, and the two brothers were eventually buried here. There's 22 crypts inside this impressive mausoleum. It's 30 feet high. About half those crypts are occupied. It's about 30 feet wide, and it's made out of some beautiful, beautiful granite that came down from Index. It was shipped down by railroad and then here by truck up to this second highest spot in the cemetery. Now, this is beautiful. The door is about 6 inches thick, granite from the state of Maine. Everything about this is very impressive. The only really bad thing is we have no architecture drawings at all. It was about $30,000 to build this at the time. We have no record of anything. In fact, there was supposed to be a brass monument to the mom sitting in a chair on top of the door. We have a drawing, but we don't think it was ever installed, although there are bolts up there that could have been used. Anybody in Everett growing up used to climb this monument, your high school days, whatever. Please don't do it today. It's very, very dangerous. People have been injured and killed here. And I have to say, I've climbed it, and it's scarier than heck coming down. So stay away, just come out here and admire it. Beautiful, beautiful. It's got a gas chandelier inside, it used to anyway. So it's impressive in every which way. This is the famous Rucker Monument, Rucker Tomb Mausoleum. Well, this is the grave of our deputy, Jefferson Beard, from Everett, and this is the beginning of a very, very sad time in Everett history. On November 5th, 1916, a group of Wobblies, industrial workers of the world, came up from Seattle. Now, there's a whole history behind this that I don't have the hour to tell you about, but they came up on a steamer from Seattle, and the plan was to come into Everett and make a speech, support all the unions, and so on. Everett was a union town and a very violent union town. Well, the mill workers got a whole group of deputies together, maybe as many as 200, and said, these guys are coming to burn down Everett. And it didn't take much to convince them. So as the steamer pulled in to the Everett Harbor, down right at the base of Hewitt, where the Anchor Tavern is there now, and we do have a monument down there, these guys pulled up, met by all the deputies, and the Wobblies wanted to come ashore, and the deputies, including Jefferson Beard here and Sheriff McRae, They said, you're not coming ashore, who's your leader? We want to talk to him. They said, we're all leaders. Well, somehow a shot rang out. It could have come from the boat, it could have come from the dock. Wolfely said that they didn't have any guns, although many were found afterwards. So there was a big shootout, and at least 5 Wolfleys got killed, probably more went into the water. 2 people on the dock got killed, many got wounded, and Jefferson Beard was killed. We don't know, sometimes they say it might have even been friendly fire from the dock, it could have been from the boat. But this was the infamous Everett Massacre, and it was on the front page of almost every newspaper in the United States the next morning. It didn't have the name Massacre, but it was quite the shootout, and that was the labor history of Everett. You need to read a lot more about it. But Jefferson Beard is the only one of the casualties that's here in Evergreen Cemetery. One of my favorite stories of many here in Evergreen is William Mesher. He was a baker in the early days of Everett, and unfortunately in his young age he developed a pretty bad paralysis. In fact, eventually he was in a special made wheelchair. He couldn't get up, he was kind of laid on his back to keep him from being in pain, and it kept getting worse. Well, he died at a young age. Before he died, he stipulated in his will that he wanted to be buried in that position on a couch. So down underneath here, Mesher is buried on a hand-carved couch where he's laying in a prostrate position, and the local ladies, they made special pillows for him and coverings. Cemetery, they came out here at 5 in the morning so there wouldn't be a crowd, dug a great big hole and put him in a box and buried him under here. So his nickname is the Eternal Couch Potato here in Evergreen Cemetery. Okay, John Diefenbacher, he was one of the business owners in Everett. In fact, there's a great Diefenbacher building down on Hewitt that's still standing, and he's buried in this location right here. Very successful businessman. He loved his beer. Everett went dry in the 20s, and he still had his beer at all times during his dinner. So that's what happens when you come from Germany. You're a good beer drinker. That's Diefenbacher. Eugene Mcgill was an Irishman working in Everett. He came here in 1891, right during the boom times. And he used to commute down the Snohomish River by boat into Everett, which wasn't unusual. Nowadays we think of cars or even trains, but a lot of the traffic in the early days and passenger traffic, they'd come down the Snohomish River or they come from Snohomish to Everett. So Mcgill was also a big supporter of the Catholic Church in Everett. Right behind him here, we have the Ross family. He was the member of the Citizens Committee of 21. In the early formation of Everett, before we had a mayor, they had a citizen committee. So he was one of the 21 that made all the original rules and regulations and laid out the plans for Everett. Very interesting guy. He married well. His wife, Ellen McDougall, she was the daughter of the sister of Captain Alexander McDougall, who was famous for building the whaleback ships that used to come down the Snohomish River and in other areas around. We only built one in Everett, but they were very impressive ships. They were a unique design. Most of them were built up in the Great Lakes, like Superior, Wisconsin. So that's the Ross family. We have a Civil War vet here that's very unique. This is Cicero Hunter, and I'm going to read you off my notes about him because it had a unique history. Hunter was born in March of 1842 in Kentucky and was a slave until he was 5 years old, when he somehow received his freedom and lived with his grandmother. He could also read and write, which is very unusual then. He enlisted in March of 1864 toward the end of the Civil War in Washington, D.C. He was in the 32nd Infantry of the Colored Troops Company K. He joined under the name John Clark from Detroit. We don't really know why. He mustered out in August of 1865 as a private and joined the Merchant Marines for 4 years. He then worked as a railroad porter in Philadelphia. In 1907, Cicero was living in Bellingham by the census, and in 1910 he had his own farm in Granite Falls. He died in the Everett Hospital in 1916. His last address was 2916 Cedar. He was first buried in Everett's Greenwood Cemetery and then moved over here at one of the very last bodies moved in June of 1921. His grave was unmarked for about 80 years here in the cemetery. It's a very interesting history, one of our colored soldiers from the Civil War. We have William Columbus Cox here, Everett's first doctor. He used to commute into Everett in the early days by horseback, where he had his practice. Later, he was one of the ones that invested and built the Everett Medical Dental Building on Colby and California Street, right downtown Everett. That's where his big, beautiful home was, which we sadly lost. He was an early advocate of the automobile. In fact, he owned one of the early ones in Everett. And he advocated for having smooth roads so you wouldn't shake up your body too much as you were driving along and stay healthier. Lewis Haybrook here. The name could sound familiar to some of you that ever go up Highway 2 and go hiking. Haybrook Lookout is up there along Highway 2. It's a beautiful hike. He's our only, that we know of, Civil War veteran. Was a Confederate. He was in the Virginia Infantry during the war. He also is probably our most successful Civil War veteran. He came here, started a sawmill, and there was actually a town named Haybrook up toward Index. Got about 250 people, had a very successful sawmill. So, very interesting guy, a lot of history here. Another one of our people that was quite an overachiever after he got out of the Civil War. So many of them had injuries, died of their injuries, but he did okay. I'm going to read a little bit about my notes on the Jackson family. This is the Peter Jackson family. Of course, all of you know we had Senator Henry Martin Jackson, who's buried in the other end of the cemetery. He was our famous senator from the state of Washington for years and years. Everett High School graduated, Longfellow School graduate, maybe the most famous person to come out of Everett. But Peter and Maureen Jackson lived at 3602 Oaks. Both parents were immigrants from Norway. They came to Everett and they were married in 1897, married at the Lutheran Church where they met. Henry Jackson was the fifth and last of the Jackson children. He had three sisters, Gertrude, Agnes, and Marie, and one brother, Arthur. Gertrude, the oldest, was very close to Henry Jackson, was the one that named him Scoop because he reminded her of a comic strip character who used to get out of work and make others do his work for him. Gertrude, she was a teacher at Garfield Elementary School, and my dad had her as a teacher. So when I wrote my book, Milltown Boy, I went to Peter Jackson, the son of Senator Henry Jackson, who sadly is now gone, and he found me a great picture of Gertrude Jackson, his aunt. So this is the Jackson family, very interesting people. We're going to talk here about Joseph Morningway. He was just 30 years old when he died. He was a member of the Redmond organization here in Everett. He was a Teamster. They had an annual get-together down in Seattle where they had a fake shootout battle with the Washington National Guard, where they fired fake bullets, little wads. Well, unfortunately, Joe was hit a little too close with one of these fake bullets, and he ended up bleeding to death on the spot, which was really, really sad. He had a tremendous funeral, and the Redmond group, they erected this monument. Now, Everett's not, in this cemetery, we're not known for our great monuments other than the Rucker Tomb and a few others like McChesney, but this one is maybe my favorite monument in the cemetery. It's just a beautiful piece of work, and they felt pretty bad about the whole situation, obviously. Okay, we're going to take a few minutes here and talk about the Wellington Disaster, which was a spectacular and sad train disaster up towards Stevens Pass. In 1910, the early morning hours of March 1st, an avalanche roared down the windy mountainside by Stevens Pass, taking out 2 Great Northern trains and 96 victims. Well, books have been written about this. You'll have to read the story, but it's very, very tragic. One of the worst train disasters in U.S. history, and certainly the worst natural disaster in Washington State history. There were only 23 survivors. The Cascade Tunnel eventually replaced the line that was damaged during this time, and now you can hike along that. That's the Iron Goat Trail area. We have 9 of the Great Northern employees that are buried mostly in this area right here in Evergreen Cemetery. And this marker right here is for Louis George Walker. He was the African-American cook and steward to the Great Northern Division Superintendent James H. O'Neill, who did survive. So they were buried in this area right here. Tremendous disaster. You have to read about it to get more of the story. And it always makes me wonder, because my grandmother, when she came from Norway, came across that same route just a few months earlier. Who knows what can happen with history? Well, here we have old Joe Irving, one of the real characters of early Everett, I'll have to say. He was a logger, a lumberman, manager of the Monte Cristo Hotel, and one of 2 deputies wounded on the city dock during the Everett Massacre. He was shot twice in the foot. Irving was legendary for his toughness and wasn't afraid to do anything. Usually during his negotiations for business or with politicians in Everett, he always carried his pistol, and many times he would pull his pistol out and wave it around during negotiations. You didn't want to mess with old Joe. He also brought in residents of Ballard and paid them $1 a head to vote for Everett to become the county seat over Snohomish. Got quite a few votes that way, and it worked out. But Joe Irving right here, early Everett character. This is a unique marker because it was just discovered in the last decade. This is Rachel Wolfely. We don't know that much about her, but she was married to a Civil War veteran back in Kansas. And when they were tracing a lot of the Civil War roots around this area, someone discovered, oh my gosh, this is the great-great-great-grandmother of President Obama, buried here in Evergreen Cemetery. She had a concrete marker here that was busted. In fact, her name was spelled wrong. Now she just has one of these temporary markers. But please, somebody who knows him, send a letter to President Obama. Let's get a real nice, decent marker here for his great-great-great-grandmother. And here we have one of my favorite people in Evergreen Cemetery. This is Emma Yule. She's kind of been forgotten over the years, but recently we've really found a lot of history on her, and we really admire what a person she was. She arrived in Everett at 28 years old and became one of Everett's very first, in fact, the first full-time school teacher. She was single because all female teachers had to be in Everett. As Everett grew, she was promoted to principal, but the promotion was short-lived because they gave the job to a man. It was unusual for a woman to be a principal. Less than 5 months later, well, then she became a principal again in 1894, but she was again replaced by a man. Less than a year later, she was elected superintendent of Everett Public Schools in 1897, and again, 3 years later, replaced by a man. So that was her poor history that way. In 1900, she left Everett. She taught in Juneau, Alaska. Later was a professor of English at the College of Architecture in the University of the Philippines. We do have some nice pictures of her from that point in time. And she retired in the 1930s, where she moved to California. She died in 1939, and luckily she was buried here in Evergreen, so we can pay our respects. And just recently we had a very interesting thing with a citizens committee that was put together. We got the latest park in Everett named Emma Yule Park by the new YMCA. And a good friend of mine, Deb Fox, wrote a very good comic novel, graphic novel on Emma Yule. You'll have to get that. Right next to Emma Yule are her 2 nieces, which are also very famous early settlers in Everett and women. This was the Rigby sisters. They arrived in the early 1900s. They owned and operated a professional photo studio from 1905 to 1915. Also very unusual to have a successful studio if you were female. But they did very well and have some nice pictures that are surviving today. A couple of them here of early Evergreen Cemetery, which I really love. Alice died of cancer, and Clara soon left the business, but they had a very big impact on early Everett history. So we have 3 of the movers and shakers from the female side here in Everett. Okay, that concludes our tour of the old part of Evergreen Cemetery. There's still a lot to go and a lot of more interesting grave sites. We'll do it another time. This tour was put together by Historic Everett, and you can look them up online. This is a great nonprofit historic preservation group here in Everett that I'm proud to be a member of and one of the founders. I encourage everybody to come and walk through our beautiful cemetery, look at the rhododendrons, look at the trees, take care of the graves, please tread lightly and really enjoy. It's a great place for a picnic. Also, when you have time, please get a chance to read my book called Milltown Boy. It's available here in Everett, and it tells about my family's history coming here to Everett. So a big thank you, and have fun roaming around these grounds. It's just a beautiful place.